Good evening. Welcome to this virtual public program of the American Philosophical Society and its David Center for the American Revolution. This week, we are celebrating the 315th birthday of Benjamin Franklin. Dr. Franklin founded the American Philosophical Society in 1743 when he was just 37 years old, and today we honor him for the creation and legacy of this thinking, drinking, and eating society. It is especially timely today that we are now often hearing one of Ben's most famous quips: a republic if you can keep it. It is perhaps less well known, but equally important, that throughout his life, Dr. Franklin thought well of and did well in serious and sustained contact with Native American communities. This aspect of Franklin's beliefs and practices may have originated with the influence of his mother, Abiah Folger, who hailed from an island off Massachusetts where whites and Native Americans remained peaceful during King Philip's War. It is thus fitting that the American Philosophical Society acknowledges with respect that it resides in Lenape-Hoking, the homeland of the Lenape people, whose historical relationships with this land continue to this day. We recognize their continued presence and perseverance despite centuries of land theft, removal, and persecution of their language and cultural traditions. Throughout its history, the Society has benefited from its residents in this part of Lenape land, now called Philadelphia. We honor the Lenape community and those of other Native peoples through our collections, fellowships, research awards, and outreach activities. While we at the Society continue to admire Dr. Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and other founding members for their key roles in the formation of our nation, for their leadership of the Society, and for their devotion to science, education, and other noble causes, we are also much aware of their faults, most significantly their slaveholding. We at the APS are committed to sustaining the better parts of their legacies while working towards a future of inclusion, diversity, equity, and access, the APS idea. Although our facilities are physically closed to all but staff, we remain committed to serving our mission of promoting useful knowledge. Please check the events link on the APS website, www.amphilsoc.org, both for our traditional offerings and for news of forthcoming virtual events. This evening's event is inspired by the current and future exhibition of the Museum of the APS, Dr. Franklin, Citizen Scientist. That exhibition was curated by Mellon Curatorial Fellows Janine Yorimoto Bolt and Emily Margolis. It was originally slated to open in April 2020, but for reasons we know all too well, it is now optimistically scheduled for April 2021. However, you can now enjoy a wonderful virtual tour of the exhibition led by Janine and Emily by going to www.amphilsoc.org and scrolling down the page for Tour Dr. Franklin, Citizen Scientist. And I would note that the exhibition highlights social, racial, and gender inequalities of Franklin's lifetime, as well as his scientific contributions. But let us turn now to tonight's discussion of Benjamin Franklin's political science, a conversation between Carla J. Mulford and the Society's librarian, Patrick Spero. Their discussion will, of course, be followed by a question and answer period, and you should feel free to introduce your questions at any time using the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. Carla J. Mulford is Professor of English and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Pennsylvania State University. Professor Mulford has been working for 25 years on projects related to Franklin's scientific and diplomatic careers and is just completing a monograph entitled Benjamin Franklin's Electrical Diplomacy. It examines the intersection of Franklin's science and politics, first in Philadelphia, then in London, and finally in Paris, and by extension, all of Europe. Professor Mulford has published some 11 books, but she reports that her current preoccupation with Benjamin Franklin has yielded about 20 essays, book chapters, and blog entries, in addition to an earlier book, Benjamin Franklin and the Ends of Empire. Her shorter works treat Franklin's scientific activities, his beliefs, his reputation for masculinity, his educational liberalism, and other topics. Not only is Professor Mulford the ideal person to guide our thinking about Dr. Franklin and his legacy this evening, but I would note that she's also received a research grant from the APS. I'm delighted to turn the virtual dais over to Carla Mulford.
Carla, it's great to see you.
Yes, good to see you.
And, thanks to everybody for tuning in for our commemoration of Benjamin Franklin's birthday. And I'm really excited to have a conversation with you, Carla, about Franklin and science and politics. But before we get there, I just want to remind all of our attendees that they are encouraged to ask questions as they come to them. Please submit your questions through the Q&A feature. We will get in about half an hour after Carla and I have a brief conversation and see where that goes. We'll start taking some of the questions from the audience, but please feel free to ask multiple questions and just as they come in, use that Q&A function on the bottom of your screen there. Carla, you know, our exhibition, which you all can see online virtually, really explores Franklin in science. And as I was going through the exhibition and the catalog, which just got released, we have a catalog you can purchase online on our website if you're interested. I kept coming back to a question about Franklin and his early science. We know a lot about Franklin, the scientist, when it comes to electricity, when it comes to his work with currents in the ocean and meteorology and climate. But what was his initial exposure to science? And I know a lot of that probably depends on how one defines science, especially in the 18th century, where the very concept itself wasn't really yet cohered. So I don't know, but what was his first entree into the scientific world?
I think that's a great question, Patrick. And again, thank you for having me. Thank you for the generous introduction, Bob. This is a topic that is dear to me. I can't wait to see your exhibition. You know, ideally in person, ideally very soon, if possible. Franklin's exposure to science, you know, I think has a lot to do with the kind of world he lived in and the way that world compares to our own today. People in earlier times lived what I think of as richer lives in a multidimensional world. As ideas about the origins of the universe changed, so did many people's orientation to the natural world. There were still those like Jonathan Edwards who, following Newton, believed that, for instance, discovering the beauty of a spider's web was studying the glory of the Christian God. But there were many more who were interested in inquiry for the sake of inquiry, not to establish that there was a master craftsman governing the universe, but merely to find out the intricacies of the natural world in order to discover properties that would assist mankind. This latter group is where I would sort of place Franklin. So in terms of science, and here I'm thinking of the broader concept of understanding nature and the natural world, I would say that as a youth in Boston, he probably observed very closely the tallow chandlery. I had an opportunity to look at a Crown soap recipe offered available at the Library Company of Philadelphia, and see that in terms of measurement, it's actually very precise science. The development of soap and the candle work that the shop would have done. I think also in terms of his youth working in James Franklin's print shop, he would have been mixing and using ink. He, you know, would have come in as filament that he would have had to manufacture ink from. that takes a certain kind of scientific precision. So what I'm trying to get at is that the very three-dimensional world, the world of physical objects, likely enabled him to engage in some of the practices that he ended up using for much of his life. I think, for instance, of the wharf he talks in his autobiography about the wharf he created with his young friends out of constructors' materials that were left by the seaside. They created a nice wharf that, of course, they had to go dismantle. Just the ingenuity of establishing a wharf in the, given the tides, the flux of the water, suggests an ability to understand the dimensions, the physical dimensions of the natural world they were living in. Franklin early on was interested in the work of John Wise, who created arguments about the proportions between a land's productivity and the population it could serve. Wise was also interested in the idea of creating opportunities to take shares in land. So in his more mature years, by the time he got to Philadelphia, and here, mature is late teenager, early 20s, he was interested in methods to avoid counterfeit paper bills. He learned this method from Joseph Brentnall for making prints of leaves and other objects. Franklin used John Wise to support the idea of creating a relationship between land, its productivity, and population, and he suggested the usefulness of paper currency in order to give paper notes a sound basis. And he used properties that his friend Joseph Brentnall taught him. And here, I think it would be useful for us to show those slides, Jessica. So this is one of the first prints that Brentnall showed Franklin. These are leaves and feathers. And the next one is a rattlesnake herb. They ended up making a publication talking about the process of printmaking.
Great. So you mentioned the library company in your answer, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how, and one of the reasons, as I understand it, Franklin and his civically minded colleagues created the library company was to share knowledge. So how did somebody like Franklin get access to scientific knowledge, especially in the colonial setting, and how did they share it amongst themselves?
That's a really good question. Scholars in the history of science have been articulating an ongoing narrative that science wasn't something that came down from above. It was something that was generated by artisans and working people. And Franklin is a good example of that. The idea being that the day-to-day, the examination of the day-to-day operations of the world ought to be credited to laboring people who are actually doing that activity, not the theorists sitting in their armchairs and libraries trying to sort of articulate theories about the world. Franklin, because much of the scientific endeavor that he was interested in was taking place in Britain, he and his friends learned by reading about experiments and attempting to reproduce those experiments themselves. Franklin's junto, a collection of bright artisans from different trades and walks of life, formed the library company in 1731. They purchased books covering imperial subjects, trade and navigation, philosophy and natural philosophy, and literature. They read widely and they shared their ideas. Prior to this, Franklin had made friends with James Logan, who was secretary to William Penn and colonial agent. And Logan actually liked Franklin, and Franklin liked Logan. Logan gave Franklin complete access to his library. Peter Collinson, who was the book merchant for the library company, that is, Peter Collinson, fellow of the Royal Society, was in London and ended up being the person to whom the junto actually wrote and asked books to be sent. Collinson also sent Franklin his first glass tube, along with publications about experiments being conducted in Germany. I think the kind of information networks among laboring people, Collinson was a merchant, were what really helped sponsor the activities of what we still call the Enlightenment, but it was an Enlightenment largely fostered, spurred on by the work of artisans.
That's great. You know, and your answer prompted a question that's very relevant for the American Philosophical Society. We often get asked all the time, or people that aren't familiar with us associate us with philosophy as it is today. But you know, you just used the word natural philosopher. So I didn't know if for our viewers today, if you could talk a little bit about, you know, the word scientist didn't come into, as I understand it, into usage until the 19th century. So what was a natural philosopher? What was a natural historian? Why did they choose those terms to describe what we today would say is a scientist?
Mhm. That's a really good question. I'm not sure I have a great answer for it. The idea of science is associated with 19th century work in laboratories and with machinery associated with science. The thing is that people didn't really separate themselves out as literateurs and people who studied medicine and people who did experimental philosophy. They all considered themselves men of letters. And those who happened to be interested in the properties of the natural world tended to call themselves tended to be working in a domain called natural philosophy. We find that by the time people like James Watt emerge and their machinery emerges in the 1790s, 1800s, 1810s, 1820s, there begins to be a separation of métier, of those who are artisans working on machinery and those who are working in theoretical areas like chemistry, for instance, people studying gases, etc. And that's when, you know, the nomenclature we tend to associate with scientific practice begins to emerge. I think largely because of the challenge to the upper classes that people of working classes presented. I think I'm going to give an example about James Watt. James Watt wanted to engage in having priority of discovery against Cavendish, and Cavendish from the upper classes was able to persuade people that no, his experiments created priority. So there began to be a bit of a tension between the classes as to who was the primary scientist and scientific mind behind the activities that wasn't around in the 18th century. In the 18th century, the larger question was, are we studying the natural world to celebrate their Christian God, or are we studying the natural world to make lives better for human beings?
Oh, that's great, thank you. In your answer, you also mentioned James Logan, who is a really fascinating figure, and I don't know if you could tell her, who was very close to Franklin and really influential in early Philadelphia and Pennsylvania history and in scientific circles beyond just North America. So I don't know if you could tell us a little bit more about Logan and his relationship with Franklin, which I think is particularly interesting because, as you said, they were close and they were friends and they were colleagues, scientific, intellectual, but they were political enemies in some ways. So I don't know if you could talk about that relationship.
Yeah, I actually talk about it a little bit in my book on empire. Logan was by birth from Ireland, and he ended up coming over and serving as the Penn's land agent. He had the largest library in the region, and he was extremely learned himself. He tended to like Franklin because Franklin had a sort of a level of curiosity that matched Logan's own. Probably if there had not been the question about politics and who should be ruling the colony, they would have remained friends forever. But Franklin ended up, being concerned about the rights of citizens, who were actually on the ground here doing the labor. I have to say, I'm in central Pennsylvania. There are towns named Loganton in this region. And the names of the original settlers in central Pennsylvania in the from the 1760s through 1780s, they tend to have Irish and Scottish and Scots-Irish names. And these were people who, Logan wasn't around in the area, the time when this area was settled, but the settlers tended to follow the same paths that Logan set out for them. Logan is an interesting case of someone who came from a country, Ireland, that was itself, under British rule, and wanted to assist the rule of Britons here in North America.
That's great. And you mentioned Logan's library being so large. And I know Franklin's library was dispersed after his death.
Yes.
People have gone back and trying to recreate it. Can you tell us a little bit about Franklin's library and maybe if there's anything about how it changed over time or what his interests were?
Franklin had a very large library, very diverse. He was very proud of the ownership of books. He started early on publishing the catalog for the library company. And as they kept adding volumes, he kept making longer library catalogs. In terms of his own library, I would encourage you to encourage the audience to think about looking at a book called, I think it's called Benjamin Franklin's Library, that is Ed Wolf's compilation, and it's been added to by Kevin Hayes. It was published about 10 or perhaps 15 years ago. His library was dispersed, and so much of what is in that volume is an attestation to the labor of love that was Ed Wolf's as he tried to recapture based on the account books, some of which are in the American Philosophical Society, the account books of purchases made. It's painstaking work. Franklin was interested in collecting in all areas. In the years when he was a younger man in Philadelphia, these earlier years we're talking about when he was working as an artisan, he was really interested in imperial practices. And so he was reading in what was taking place in Russia. He was interested in the trade routes. He was interested in the so-called Silk Road. He was trying to understand navigation better. And being a self-taught person, this was a very large endeavor for him to engage in. So books made it possible for him to, books in modern languages made it possible for him to begin to understand the sort of the global system that he was interested in navigating in terms of trade and the sort of improvement for Philadelphians. I don't know if I answered your question very well, but I know that the introductory matter and the editorial matter in the Ed Wolf and Hayes book is stellar. It's a wonderful volume. It's the only one that it reliably tells us about the stages of Franklin's library across time.
Yeah, and it's an incredible detective story. If you want to check out that story, where I believe it goes, Ed Wolf, because the books were dispersed, he was able to figure out Franklin's cataloging system and use those numbers to go back and recreate this library. It really is a remarkable case of just historical detective work, and like you said, a labor of a lifetime of love to recreate that. And your answer actually reminded me of a couple of things in the APS library. We have 70% of Franklin's correspondence, as most people know, but we also have some of his books. And one of the largest we have are a collection of enormous maps. If I remember correctly, most of them are of Russia. And so I assume this is part of that very moment you're talking about in Franklin's life. The other big collection of books we have is science books. We have and we continue to try and acquire books that came from Franklin's library, especially those that were his scientific books. And one of the things that just looking on the shelves that these are on is that he had very diverse range of interest. And even though he's most famous for electricity over time, he was a scientist that dabbled in so much, and not just dabbled, but made real contributions. I didn't know if you could talk a little bit more about Franklin's entire scientific legacy, maybe even not even talking about electricity, but everything else.
I'd have to be looking at your library shelf and be reminded of everything else. He had it. I think he was a genius, and of course I'm fond of him, and so I'm totally in awe. The fact that he was self-taught is really what most sticks out to me. In terms of science, he was interested in measuring the temperatures of the ocean. He traveled many times back and forth across the Atlantic, and he kept a record book of the temperatures of the water. He was interested in the extent to which sailors tended to sail the same routes. He understood from whaling relatives that it wasn't necessarily that the whales ran a particular way, but that the winds were easier to navigate. And so he worked with his cousin, Timothy Folger, to create a map of the Gulf Stream. he was really interested in the extent to which people might measure and perhaps even predict what was going on in the natural world in order to assist the sailors as they were sailing the oceans. Once he established that electricity was an action derived from positive and negative charges, Franklin was interested in seeing electrical action of lightning how electrical action of lightning might be controlled. So I want to just return to the pragmatic aspect of Franklin's electricity. It came to a question of whether pointed rods or round rods would work better. He was interested in the actual pragmatic application of theoretical science. And so if you read his experiments and observations on electricity, it sounds entirely theoretical. He has potential outcomes. He lists interfering mechanisms with the proper experiment. But all of this is to the end that he doesn't want fires to occur in Philadelphia. He certainly doesn't want a fire in Philadelphia, much like the Great London Fire of 1666. And so much of his scientific activity was designed to assist the trade and navigation, the circulation of goods, the production of goods in North America.
I'm sorry, keep going.
I wanted to say, he was interested in the potential medical applications of electricity. He worked with paralysis patients. He worked with patients who were deaf in an effort to see if electricity would spark their ability to regain their physical condition. It did not. Franklin's this experimentation with electricity is a good example of a great discovery that in the 19th century, I might say, went awry in the electroshock treatments that were given individuals, and maybe still given today. One can't control one's legacy for the negative impact of whatever it is one has discovered. And the discovery of electricity and its applicability for human beings is something that, he was just making at the outset very clear directions, don't try this. And that resulted from the fact that he nearly electrocuted himself during one of his experiments.
A thought came to mind in your answer, going back to how you described the development of kind of scientist and Watt being, because he was a practitioner, a mechanic in some ways, and that there's a class division. And the way you described Franklin just now, it's almost like, would you say that Franklin was a forerunner to Watt, and that one of the things that distinguished him perhaps from his peers in England and elsewhere was not just this theoretical interest, but a real practical use?
One thing I don't know about Franklin is what his speech sounded like. To compare with Watt was Scottish, and Scottish people were not looked well upon in London because their speech patterns were significantly different. Some of the best orators in the British Parliament actually came from Scotland. When they hit London, they took elocution lessons. Franklin, from the start, was able to get to know well-to-do people, and he liked talking to working people. And so I'm wondering, and I don't know how to establish this, I'm not a linguist. I'm wondering whether he was, because he was perceptive about everything else, I'm wondering whether he was perceptive enough to understand that one's speech patterns need to shift a little bit when speaking with someone of superior rank to oneself. And I surmise, because he was very perceptive as a human being and a great rhetorician as a writer, that Franklin probably managed to attune his demeanor and his speech maybe faster than some others of his station, who otherwise would always have remained, because of the fairly rigid standards of class and elocution, would always have remained as artisans and never have been able to to meet with kings.
Oh, wow, that's fascinating. So, and we were going to talk about science and politics too. So I want to maybe switch a little bit to talking about Franklin and politics. But one of the things that, you know, I know that you've thought about, you've written about, you've spoken about are how we shouldn't separate these two. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about Franklin and his rise in politics in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, and in Pennsylvania, and then his, you know, travel to England and eventually France, and how his political role and his scientific roles were interwoven and played off of each other.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So it sounds like both Philadelphia and then once he goes to London. So I want to say, because it's something that is easy to forget when we're talking about someone as talented as Franklin. There were people working for Franklin behind the scenes. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about Deborah Reed, who made it possible for Franklin, I think, to become whom he became. I want to say as well, given the interest of the APS in questions of equity, the people who made Deborah Reed Franklin and Franklin's life possible were people who were enslaved by the Franklins. And so Jemima, whom Gary Nash, a wonderful historian, did a great piece, I think that came from a talk he gave at the APS. Gary Nash surmises that Jemima and Deborah Reed became great friends because Franklin was away so long. But so I do want to suggest the extent to which the domestic aspect of Franklin's life, its being stable, made it possible for him to engage in some of the civic endeavors that he engaged in. Her presence, Deborah Reed's presence in the household, enabled him. She took care of his son, William, who was born out of wedlock. And she made it possible for the first time that the newspaper and print shop ended up not being in debt, but actually started succeeding. So I want to give a little bit of credit to Deborah, who freed up some of Franklin's time so that he could become clerk of the assembly in 1736. He served in that capacity until 1750. And became an elected member of the assembly in 1751. He served until 1764. And then periodically as he came back to North America. His scientific efforts, in my view, dovetailed with this political work. A crucial factor driving his concern to discover the properties of electricity and the relative energy and lightning lay in his concern to prevent fires from decimating the city of Philadelphia, as I've said. His original experiments seem, if you read the books, they seem to suggest they were done for the sake of pure science. But it was the application of knowledge learned that drove his experiments in the first place. I'm trying to argue that science and civics dovetailed in his mind. To shift to London, I do have some notes I'm sort of working from here. The years in London between 1757 and 1775, he spent most of those years in London. Those were intense years for Franklin. He was lionized across Europe for the accomplishments of his electrical experiments and his theories on topics as diverse as the courses and causes of the Gulf Stream, the origin of musical sound using glass tubes, the causes and effects of temperature change in maritime climates, the usefulness of crop rotation to agricultural productivity, and the chemical properties of matter. He received accolades from many different countries, including France, Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands, and he spent time with natural philosophers like Sir John Pringle, David Hume, and Henry Home Lord Kemms. He made friends with the most important intellectuals, natural historians, and political philosophers in Britain and Europe. He enjoyed London's club culture and established a social routine shortly for that lasted for most days of the week. On Mondays, he tended to dine with scientists, philanthropists, and explorers at the George and Vulture, where he enjoyed the company, for instance, of John Ellicott, a famed clockmaker and fellow of the Royal Society. He was an astronomer as well. He would become clockmaker to the king. Occasionally, he'd meet at the George and Vulture James Cook, who was in the midst of launching his military career with the Navy. Alternate Thursdays, he spent dining with his favorite group, the Club of Honest Whigs, at St. Paul's Coffee House. He met key scientists, philosophers, and political theorists in most of these clubs where he became a regular. He also met Richard Price and Joseph Priestley, whose innovations in education and natural philosophy interested Franklin. So, I think we can find, if we look at his social circles, whether we're looking in Philadelphia or we're looking in London, his social circles included people who were involved in, at the ground level in terms of politics, but also involved in scientific endeavors, what we would today call scientific endeavors.
Great, thanks. And we've got a few questions coming in, and I want to encourage everybody, if they have a question, to use the Q&A feature on the bottom of our screen. We're going to get to them in a moment. But before we did, Carla, there's just a couple other questions I want to ask you myself. I have a lot more, but I have to limit my time. The first is, you helped Janine Bolt and Emily Margolis and us, the society, with our exhibition and planning and thinking about content. I don't know if there are a few objects that, particularly speak to you about Franklin as a person, Franklin and science, that maybe are in our exhibition or just out there in the world.
Sure, there are. It would be difficult to understress the importance of the Gulf Stream map that's currently showing. It was extremely important that people navigating the Atlantic understand the currents of wind and the way that the thermodynamics with water, the temperatures of water. And so when he made public, this was published, when he made public this information in the 1760s, it changed navigation for the better. I haven't studied this well enough to know whether there were fewer ships foundering on rocks. My surmise is that there must have been. It was characteristic of Franklin to make a comparison with Watt. It was characteristic of Franklin that when he knew something worked for sure, he wanted to make it public. James Watt, by contrast, wanted to keep most things private. And so Watt's life he was involved for about 20 years of his life in defending his patents for his different machinery and scientific techniques. Franklin abhorred patents. And so there's a significant difference in the mentality of people like Franklin and Watt. Franklin's discoveries, he wanted them to be made public and made available to all people. And so the thing that most interests me is he would discover something, have it tested, tell other people about it in letters, and then have them test it. And if it actually turned out to be true, he would make a record and report on. So the continued publication and republication of his experiments, he wasn't trying to make money on the books. He was trying to get the information out there for succeeding generations of readers. So, so the Gulf Stream map is very important to my thinking. But I also, Jessica, if we could shift to the glass tube. I don't know if you could bring that up for us. Yeah. So, so Franklin's identification of electrical fire, as he called it, likely first emerged from his observations on the sparks emerging when one rubs a glass tube with different fabrics or agents. He went on to devise an shortly after he sort of determined how sparks arise, and he called that electrical fire. Shortly after that, by the early 1750s, he devised an electrostatic machine. The glass tube marks his original experiments, but the machinery, he actually had several machines made, sent them around to friends, and asked them to continue with experiments. And so, again, this is the idea that science and civic life were shared endeavors. They were not exclusive, but rather inclusive of additional, people who wanted to take part in the kind of activity they were engaging in. So, Jessica, if we could shift to the next slide. So, so this is an oil cane. It's a cane. And so Franklin's, and this is not, I'm not sure this is Franklin's cane. Patrick, do you know if that's Franklin?
I don't know if we know for certain. I think there's evidence for it, but I don't know how good the provenance is. But yeah.
Okay, so his idea, he learned that from seafarers, and he learned from crossing the ocean many times. He asked seafarers about why it is that the waters are calm after some ships and not calm after others. And he asked some captains of the ships where the water was calmer. He learned from them that the cooks threw overboard the leftover oil and other things from the kitchen, and that ended up calming the waters. This is an ancient concept. It goes back to Pliny and Aristotle. But Franklin learned it from seafarers and by his own observations of things taking place at sea. He was interested in testing the relative relationship between a fabric of oil placed over water. And so when he got to London, he performed, throughout England, he performed experiments on ponds and lakes in England to discover the range of effects from uses of oil on different kinds of water. As he wrote about a thin membrane of oil on a lake in 1773, I'm going to quote Franklin, "After this, I contrived to take with me whenever I went into the country a little oil in the upper hollow of my joint bamboo cane, with which I might repeat the experiment as opportunity should offer, and I found it constantly to succeed." And so he contrived to have a cane made of bamboo that had an opening at the top where he could insert oil. And when he knew he was going to be traveling, because this is the way people who are constantly inquirers work, when he knew he was going to be traveling, he would stop at ponds and lakes and try to assess the density of the water below and how much oil it would take to calm the water on top. I think it's fascinating to me. It's something, you know, I grew up at a lakeside and could make these observations by the power boat that my family had, but I, would never have thought to try to determine what the science was behind it.
I know.
If we could look at the magic circle, I don't know how much more time we have, but I just have two more things I would comment about if I could.
Yeah, we've got a lot of questions coming in, so after this, we'll switch to the questions.
Okay, so so the magic circle is up. Franklin was a master at increasingly more difficult mathematical puzzles. He began creating magic squares and circles during his assembly clerkship days because he, originally thought the meetings were pretty boring. And he doesn't quite say it that way, but he refers to this a little bit in his autobiography. He continued puzzling on them throughout his life. The Gentleman's Magazine published a couple of his magic circles, and then his magic circle of circles in the 1760s. It became a sort of thing to do if you were sort of in Franklin's circle to sort of work out these magic circles with him. The last thing if we could just look at the chess set briefly. I think this traveling chess set is perhaps my favorite item. This is a tiny item. It's hard to see because we're looking at it on screen, but this is a very small chess set. It's in, I think, a Moroccan leather case. It's my favorite item because it represents Franklin's tireless mental energy along with his sociability. You play chess with another person and it requires mental energy, and that's Franklin. His sociability was perhaps one of his greatest qualities as a diplomat because he understood how to have a conversation with a whole range of people. So yeah, so the traveling chess set, if you get to the exhibition, I hope you'll stop and marvel as I do at this object.
Yeah, and I think seeing it in person in this size, it's one of the reasons preserving these objects are so important because it really brings it home. So I want to shift to some of the questions that we've had. The first is from Manu Rodrishkin, and their question is, what do we know about Franklin's finances? How did he pay for books and his life? And if I could add, how did he fund his scientific research?
Franklin's, to speak to the collections at the American Philosophical Society, for anybody who's interested, and I believe the account books are coming online now. The American Philosophical Society actually holds most of what we know to be Franklin's account books. I mean, there are other account books available in other institutions, but the APS collection is quite large. Franklin's financial condition was supported largely by his Poor Richard Almanac. He throve as a newspaper printer, and so he, again, once he was with Deborah, he was running a sort of profit, but where he really made his money was with Poor Richard Almanac, which he published in sequential years from the 1730s until the mid 1750s, when he sold his printing business to David Hall, who had worked as his partner. So he was in a financial condition such that he was able to retire. That's how hungry people were for information. The almanacs, that he had the usual things, lists of kings and queens, the days of sunrise and sunset. But what sold his almanacs in particular were the aphorisms that he wrote, often witty, sometimes humorous, sometimes making jokes about gender. But that is the kind of fare that he offered that differentiated his almanac from all others. So that's where he made his money. He was good at saving. He was not profligate. He understood that one, should not live beyond one's means, and so that helped, of course, as well.
That's great. And I just two things to add about the account books. We do have an incredible digital project up, in which we've digitized these account books, we've transcribed the records, and we've actually run them through various software so that we know more about Franklin's business aspects. And one of the things we discovered, going back, Carla, to your point about Deborah, is that in his early account books, her hand, you can identify her hand, is far more prominent. It's significant, the amount of work that she was doing in the account books, keeping his ledgers, working with them, which I think was an important and new find that we made. And his almanacs, they ran about 48 pages long, if I remember correctly, where most other almanacs were 12 to 24 pages. So it really was, and it was filled with also scientific information, how to create this medicinal remedy and other things. So it really was a way to educate the public. And that brings me to a question from David Saylor, who wants to know about Franklin's, any interest he had with regard to Native Americans, their origins, their history, but also ways in which indigenous knowledge, their knowledge of the world, the natural world, influenced his discoveries or discoveries more generally in early America.
Mm-hmm. Franklin was sensitive to Native concerns. This perhaps is most apparent in his narrative of the late massacres. 1764, a massacre of peaceful Native people had taken place at what was called Conestoga, the Lancaster area. And the unhappy settlers who massacred these peaceful Native people were marching on Philadelphia. If you go back and look at the narrative of the late massacres, you can understand Franklin's sensitivity to the culture of Native people, his understanding of the extent to which Native people and their hospitality made it possible for the settlers to thrive in Pennsylvania. But he was also an empire man. And so I want to say that in addition to the sensitivity, he was very proud of the fact that in Pennsylvania, land was paid for by treaties. He sometimes did not appreciate what he considered to be the nefarious ways in which some members of the Penn family were engaged in treaty making. And he was quite plain about that. But he liked the idea that treaties were being made. And so among his publishing endeavors, which to my knowledge, and maybe one of our audience today would know better than I about this, But he was interested in printing the treaties. And so he engaged in a project during the 1730s and 1740s of printing all of the Indian treaties of Pennsylvania. They exist in a book that was republished in the 20th century as a collected edition of those treaties. So I would say that compared to other people, other colonizers, he had respect for Native people. But he, again, he was interested in accommodating settler need within Indian land. I think it's important that we also acknowledge that.
And there's an interesting question from Andrew Starner, who I think is associated with the Lunar Society as well. Can you talk a little bit about Franklin? And you got this with the electricity and the reanimating limbs and dead bodies. What about Franklin and pseudoscience? Now, he might not have known it was pseudoscience today, but what are some of the other things that Franklin paths he went down that today we would just say that makes no sense whatsoever?
Well, probably the effort to help paralytic patients with electricity. I would say, Franklin probably wasn't too interested in pseudoscience. I mean, I'm thinking of the Mesmer Commission. When Franklin was in France in the 1780s, the King of France asked Franklin to be the head of a commission to look into the idea of animal magnetism and discover whether Mesmer's insistence that animal magnetism occurred was just. Franklin was part of a commission that included Lavoisier, Guillotin, and many 6 other scientists who looked into the question alongside some members of the French Royal Academy. Franklin was dubious about Mesmer almost from the start. So Mesmer ended up, he was interested in having clients of upper class women in particular. And he claimed that there was an electrical charge that he could emit when he became proximate to them. This gave him an excuse to fondle them. And some of them ended up swooning and in a kind of paroxysm. And so this was part of Mesmer's claim to animal magnetism. Franklin, headed up this commission. He sort of had to. He was in the middle of diplomatic negotiations. The American government was trying to formulate itself. We were in a period of confederation, and the government needed money, and France was continuing to assist the Americans. And so, I surmise that under other circumstances, Franklin might not have chosen to lead this particular commission, but he did so because he thought it necessary. I also surmise that part of the reason he didn't like Mesmer is that Mesmer used the glass harmonica during some of his kind of seances with these people. And his continued use of it actually made the fascination and interest in the harmonica decline once the commission came out with its report that there was no such thing as animal magnetism.
Thanks. I think we have time for 2 more questions. The first one is coming from Anton Chaitkin and Peter Meyer, who are from the Lunar Society. I'm sorry, I earlier mentioned Andrew Starner being from there, but these 2 folks are from the Lunar Society in Birmingham. I don't know if you could tell us a little bit more about Franklin's relationship to the Lunar Society itself, but more generally, if you could talk about Franklin and the world of science and these type of societies like the American Philosophical Society and the roles that Franklin played in them and creating and forming them, and the roles that they played in the exchange of ideas and scientific advancement more generally. Mm-hmm.
These societies tended to be connected with one another by, through individuals who belonged to multiple ones, or by correspondence. There is a project taking place at a university in California where they're actually tracking the correspondence of different clusters Franklin's, the people with whom Franklin corresponded. I don't know about his relationship to the Lunar Society. I do know that he was fascinated with the work of James Watt, and he was fascinated with Watt's discoveries of what we today call a sort of preliminary activity of thermodynamics. He was in correspondence with Watt. He wanted, there is in Franklin's correspondence, a request that one of Watt's machines be purchased. So, and Watt is, Watt has connections to the Lunar Society. The Lunar Society was an extremely important society in the central part of England. It would be nice if one of them could be brought on board to sort of explain what their goals were. The thing I find most fascinating about them is that I'm blanking on her name, but one of the writers whom I teach, because I teach British fiction, was actually allowed to attend some of the meetings of the Lunar Society, and so there were women also, taking part in their society. I don't know about the correspondence of the Lunar Society with some of the French salons and societies, but Franklin, sometimes these societies are connected by individuals, and sometimes just because they share a similar mission and they engage in correspondence. Thank you for being here, those of you in the Lunar Society. Very grateful for your presence here.
No, it's great. It's late over there.
It is.
So the last question, it comes from several different people ask kind of this question in various different ways. And that's to situate Franklin within the history of the United States, within the history of America, and also within the history of the globe, because Franklin was a colonist. He was a member of the British Empire for the vast majority of his life. But at the same time, he looms large in our own nation's history. So is there anything you could say about Franklin in terms of anything that was distinctly American about him, or did he establish any sort of pattern or tradition that became distinctly American? Or how would Franklin himself have thought about his own position in this world for the vast majority of his life?
Franklin spent the largest part of his mature years not in America. And yet, when he was encouraged by his friends in France to stay in France, he wanted to come home to Philadelphia. We can say, well, it was the draw of Sally Franklin and her growing family. It was the draw of the remaining members and descendants of his own family. My sense is that he did, while he was a growing person, entering his maturity, he thought of himself as a Briton, but the revolution and its aftermath made him understand that he actually was an American. He thought there was a greater opportunity for laboring people. His observations of the situation, the conditions of life for laboring people in Britain, and especially in France, in Ireland, in Scotland, that is the day laborers, the people who are culling vegetables from large gardens or community garden plots. Just the day-to-day activity of laboring people was improved in North America because, as he argues in several of his writings, he, for instance, in his mid-century publication, The Interest of Great Britain Considered with Regard to Her Colonies, he's interested in the opportunities that being in America make possible. If you live in America, he argued, and this was true for his generation during the middle of the 18th century, if you lived in America, you could make enough money that you could buy yourself a small plot of land and farm it. And from that, you could gain a sustenance for your family and continue doing whatever labor it was that you were doing. So I think the condition of living for laboring people is a signal factor that made him understand that he was an American. He is, probably the most famous motions he made in Congress is that he thought there ought to be a democratic vote, that they ought to count votes. And each vote ought to count. Instead, they developed the Electoral College because they wanted to balance out interests of Southerners and Northerners. But his idea that, of democracy, of a real democracy, he was the one who spoke it. So that's, I think, peculiarly American about him, that every person ought to have the same opportunity, is something I think he believed in. At the end of his life, and to speak of opportunities and the structural divisions we face today, he was also president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. And so he made a motion in behalf of the Abolition Society. He made a motion that Congress consider abolition. That motion was not accepted well by Southerners, and they argued that they shouldn't even have it enter the record books. They finally disputed that point and decided, well, it can remain, but we're going to table that petition. So again, his sense is that individuals willing to work hard ought to be given the same kind of opportunity that everyone else has.
That's great. And I lied. There was one last.
That's American compared to the structural inequities in Europe and Britain. That's American from early on.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So here's the real last question. But it comes from Jennifer Rundles. I just saw it. And it's, if Franklin was alive today, what would you think he would be doing? Where would he be focusing his attention?
Franklin was a philanthropist. When his will was read in the 1790s, he gave it to, had a legacy that he gave to working people. So my sense is that, just as he did during his lifetime, he would want to be giving away his ideas and his money to assist other people who were worthy. Not just everybody necessarily, but people who were worthy and willing to work. Later in his life in the 1780s and actually the 1780s, he talks about, how the poor can improve their condition. He sort of believes in creating opportunities for what we today call laboring poor people. And suggests the importance of making people feel like they're creating their own future by laboring for themselves. He believed in offering, creating opportunities for people. So my guess is he'd be, a scientist probably, and engaged in scientific efforts or technological change for the betterment of humankind, but also a philanthropist.
That's great. Thank you, Carla. This was a really fantastic conversation. I learned so much. I thank all of our attendees for tuning in. And again, please check out the virtual tour online. You can walk through it and get the curators to give you kind of a behind the scenes look at the exhibit. And as I understand it, soon, not quite yet, the catalog, which has an incredible essay by the curator, Janine Bolt, in the intro, but also a fantastic photography of all the exhibition's items, including some that Carla talked about tonight in there. So please keep your eyes peeled for the catalog on our website, and hope to see you all virtually at our next talk. Thanks. Thank you again, Carla.
Thank you. Thank you.